Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this noon webinar. I see there are still lots of people logging on, so I'll go a little slow at the beginning to give people a chance to log on, but we have a lot to cover today, and I anticipate a lot of questions, so I will slowly at least get started. So today's webinar is about the recent DPU decision in Massachusetts. The Department of Public Utilities issued an order about what the electric utilities in Massachusetts can offer for electric vehicle programs for the next couple of years. So we are going to dive deep into all of that. First, though, some introductions. My name is Anna, and I am the Electric Vehicle Program Director at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. For those of you who might not be familiar with us, we are a nonprofit organization based in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and our mission is to harness the power of energy consumers to speed the transition to a low-carbon future. We have programs that help consumers access clean energy technologies, whether that be solar or wind power, or cold climate air source heat pumps, or energy efficiency, or electric cars. And then we also do advocacy work at the state and local level to advocate for strong and fair clean energy policies in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So this presentation is a little bit of a hybrid presentation. This is relevant both to our Drive Green program and to our advocacy work. So I hope you learn a little bit on both fronts. A quick caveat before we get into the meat of this presentation. We have a program called Drive Green that I've mentioned, which is a program designed to help people make the transition to electric cars. So we won't spend a lot of time in this presentation today talking about the different types of charging or the incentives available for the vehicles themselves, or any of the ins and outs of actually owning an electric vehicle. But if you have questions about that, I encourage you to check out our Drive Green website. We've got tons of information about electric vehicles in general. We can help you narrow down the choices to figure out what models would work for you. And we have lots of events coming up that talk about new models coming out or charging and all those kinds of details. So if you haven't checked out the Drive Green program yet, would definitely encourage that you do that. But without further ado, what are we talking about today? So this presentation is broken into 4 sections. In the first, I'll just give a little bit of context and talk about the process, how the Department of Public Utilities arrived at this decision and who they are in the first place. Then I'll talk about the actual proposals that the 2 big utilities in Massachusetts, National Grid and Eversource, that they put forward way back in 2021, and what we as an organization advocated for in response. The third section will talk about the actual decision, what the Department of Public Utilities ordered and what that means. And then in the fourth section, we'll talk about next steps, basically how we get from where we are now to a place where there's actually programs that consumers can go and apply for. So that is the overall outline, but I will go straight ahead and launch into context. So a very important key question to answer before we get into the details here is what is the Department of Public Utilities? So electric utilities are what is called natural monopolies. So electric utilities loosely are the companies that own and operate the wires that bring electricity from electric generators to your home. And because it doesn't make sense for 17 different companies to be running wires through our streets, it's really place-based. Wherever you are, there are wires bringing electricity to your home or business, and the company that owns and maintains those is the electric utility, and they are a natural monopoly because they just naturally own the business. But it doesn't make sense to have natural monopolies not be regulated, because then they could charge us whatever they wanted and really wreak havoc on our lives and the economy. So the Department of Public Utilities, or the DPU, exists to regulate these natural monopolies. In this case, we're talking specifically about electric utilities, or electric transmission and distribution companies, which is the technical term. So the DPU exists to protect consumers and make sure that those natural monopolies are running their businesses well. The map on the left shows you who is the electric utility for all of the communities in Massachusetts. So most of Massachusetts is served by one of three investor-owned electric utilities, National Grid, Eversource, or Unitil. On this map, Eversource is green, National Grid is the bluish purple, and Unitil is the bright orange that's just at the top there. Then there are also 41 cities and towns that have municipally owned utilities where the community itself owns the wires and maintains them. So National Grid, Eversource, and Unitil are the big investor-owned utilities. They serve most of the Commonwealth. And for this presentation, I'll focus mostly on National Grid and Eversource because they are the two biggest ones. So again, in summary, the DPU exists to protect consumers and regulates National Grid and Eversource. And one key piece that I want to point everyone's attention to is that historically, it's been the DPU's job to protect consumers, but they now have a wider mandate thanks to the climate law that passed in 2021. That said, that the DPU must now also consider climate change and equity when they make their decisions. So this was one of the first big tests, basically, of how the DPU takes on those new responsibilities, and that's something that we came back to a lot in the testimony that we provided. So this has been, I say referring to these electric vehicle dockets, has been a really long process. And so I just want to put in context a little bit the steps that have gotten us to this point. So way back when, in July of 2021, National Grid, Eversource, and Unitil filed their proposals. So they basically went to the DPU, dropped off several hundred-page documents and said, this is what we want to do on electric vehicles and electric transportation for the next 4 or 5 years. The first step after that was that there were some public hearings. At the time, we did a survey, which some of you may have filled out to inform what we would say at that public hearing, but we also shared information about how to speak at that public hearing. So some of our EV ambassadors and other members spoke at that public hearing and said, these are the elements that we think are important to us. And after that, the formal process kicked off. So for the formal process, we had to petition to be an official intervenor, which basically means we had a lovely volunteer lawyer represent us in this process. And we're accepted as one of the organizations that was allowed to provide feedback on the utilities proposals. So the first step was a round of discovery questions where we could basically ask the utilities to clarify or expand on their proposals. We had some time to review their responses to our questions and then had to submit testimony. So we submitted a couple different documents as subject matter experts, contributing our thoughts to the Department of Public Utilities, saying these are the things we think you need to take into account as you're weighing the proposals from the electric utilities. Then we had some really fun evidentiary hearings where we got to cross-examine and be cross-examined by other interveners in this process. And then we got a chance to write our final briefs, which is really like a final essay, almost saying, here are all of our thoughts in light of everything that we've learned in the discovery questions, the testimony that was submitted by other parties, and in the evidentiary hearings. Here is sort of our conclusion to the DPU. And then the DPU took a really, really long time to review all of that information. And then finally, in December of 2022, just a couple months ago, issued its final order. So this whole process from beginning to end was about 1.5 years long. And a lot of things happened during that 1.5 years that really fundamentally impact electric vehicle adoption for the next couple of years. So first, in November of 2021, we had the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, otherwise known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and that put a lot of money towards building out DC fast charging networks across the country. In July of 2022, Massachusetts passed and Governor Baker signed into law a climate law that puts lots of money into electric vehicle charging infrastructure, but also sets up an intergovernmental EV charging council. Basically, representatives from lots of different state agencies are supposed to come together and really tackle this issue of how are we going to build out charging. And then, of course, in August of 2022, President Biden signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act, which we've had many hour-and-a-half-long webinars on to talk about the really fundamental impact that will have on the fight against climate change. So all of these things which could influence how you interpret the proposals from the electric utilities happened during this 1.5-year-long process. So a lot happened, and it's very important what comes out of this very convoluted, little known process. So the DPU, in reviewing the proposals from the electric utility, is supposed to, or says it is supposed to, consider 3 criteria when it's looking at the proposals. So first, it's trying to determine whether the proposal or pieces of the proposal are in the public interest, whether they meet a need regarding the advancement of EVs in the Commonwealth that is not likely to be met by the competitive EV charging market. The DPU takes that very seriously. They don't want to do anything that will impede the development of the EV charging market naturally. And then finally, does it not hinder the development of that competitive charging market? And in theory, if the DPU can answer yes to each of these questions about a piece in the electric utilities proposal, that allows them to say yes. But ultimately, the DPU can kind of decide whatever they want based on their interpretation of all the feedback we and other interveners gave them. I want to put this in context about why this all matters, because it does. I'm glad you all think so, because you're at this webinar, but Massachusetts is legally required to reduce economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030 and 85% by 2050 in order to reach net zero emissions in 2050. And those benchmarks are set by law, but then the executive agencies get to figure out how to actually meet them. So last year we had a couple webinars and wrote some blog posts about the clean energy and climate plans for 2025 and 2030. These are the state's plan to actually reduce emissions 50% by 2030. And if you dig into the transportation section, they have done some math and figured out what we need to see for EV adoption and the build out of public charging stations to actually reduce emissions. So for vehicles themselves, there are 5.5 million cars on the road in Massachusetts. Right now, about 50,000 of them, maybe it's like 52,000 by now, are electric. And the Clean Energy and Climate Plan calculated that we need 200,000 of those to be electric by 2025 and 900,000 to be electric by 2030 in order to meet those goals. And correspondingly, we need to build out charging stations. So this is the part where these numbers, keep them in mind for the rest of this presentation. So right now, we've got about 2,000 stations with about 5,000 ports, according to the Alternative Fuels Data Center. And according to the Clean Energy and Climate Plan, we need 15,000 public ports, public stations, and 75,000 by 2030. So the proposals from the electric utilities are 4 or 5 years long, so they will get us through 2025. So the key figure to keep in mind for the rest of this presentation is we need 15,000 public charging stations. So we can see how the electric utilities proposals compare to that. This is the last slide in the context section, and this one is particularly important because I will use these terms throughout the rest of the presentation. So I want to make sure everybody knows what I mean when I say them now. So when you install a charging station, electricity goes through lots of different steps to get from the plant that is generating the electricity to your vehicle. First, there is grid scale distribution infrastructure. These are the poles and wires and technology that the electric utility owns and maintains, the distribution network, the transformers, everything behind the meter, everything that the utility owns to get the electricity to your meter. Then you may have to upgrade the electric infrastructure on your property. And this is often a costly part of installing charging stations, particularly public charging stations. So an easy example of this might be if you are a workplace and you have a parking lot and you want to install a bank of charging stations for your employees, you might have to lay new conduit and trench through a parking lot. And that can get really expensive because you've got to rip up a parking lot, lay new line, bring electric service to a place where it hasn't been. And if in the absence of any incentives, that can often be cost prohibitive, especially for public sites and workplaces. But through programs called Make Ready, the electric utility is allowed to pay for the upgrades needed to the property's electric infrastructure. So you can see the term Make Ready at the bottom. That means with a Make Ready program, the utility company will pay for, to some extent, the upgrades needed to bring the charging service or the electric service to the charging pad, like the concrete place where you will install a charger. So I will talk about Make Ready a lot during this presentation, and that means, in short, the utility will cover the costs of property infrastructure upgrades. When they do that, you still have to buy a charging unit and actually have it installed. The hardware and the installation labor, that's a cost too. And when that is covered, it is covered through a rebate. So the technical term that you'll see all over the place is EVSE, that stands for Electric Vehicle Supply Equipment. And usually that's something that a building owner will pay for and maintain and install, but the electric utilities proposed rebates on this front too. So again, you'll see Make Ready and EVSE rebates throughout this presentation. Make Ready is the infrastructure upgrades. EVSE rebates cover the hardware and the installation of the actual charger. So I hope that was all clear. And with that, I'll now dive into what it was that the electric utilities actually proposed and how we at Green Energy Consumers responded. So first, the main thing to know about these proposals is that they were huge. So National Grid and Eversource have both run Make Ready programs before. National Grid spent $40 million over a couple of years, and Eversource spent $25 million. But these proposals that they submitted in July of 2021 totally dwarfed those past programs. So National Grid's budget totaled $277 million, and Eversource totaled $191 million. Those are huge, and that is not a bad thing because we really do need an aggressive investment in infrastructure to get all the charging that we need. If you look at the original proposals of the electric utilities, you can see that they broke out estimates for how many charging stations this level of investment would result in. So on this table, we've broken out National Grid and Eversource, and we've broken it out into sort of the key segments that they broke it out to in their proposal. So public level 2 charging stations, they each had a couple thousand. Workplace level 2 each had a couple thousand. They foresaw helping build out a huge number of charging stations in residential units or residential homes that have 1 to 4 units. So that's tens of thousands of charging stations that they would help enable. And then a couple thousand more in multi-unit dwellings or residential homes that have 5 or more units. So together that totaled tens of thousands of new charging stations for each utility. And if we remember the 15,000 that we need for public charging stations by 2025, you can see that together Eversource and National Grid are somewhere around 6,000. So a little less than half of what we need by 2025. In addition, both electric utilities offered support for DC fast charging, which are the super high powered stations you see along highways. There, they measured or estimated the potential impact in megawatts rather than number of charging stations, and National Grid foresaw 32 megawatts and Eversource 27. So we'll come back to that later too. The way that both of those utilities expected to have that impact and actually help install that many charging stations is through a combination of Make Ready and those EVSE rebates. So historically, the utilities have only offered Make Ready for multi-unit dwellings, so places with 5 or more units, workplaces, and public charging locations. But in this proposal, for the first time, they offered to make support available for residences with 1 to 4 units and also fleets. So that is a big expansion of the Make Ready concept, but in addition, they expanded the budget for it. Then, for the first time, they proposed to offer those EVSE rebates for the hardware and installation costs on the customer side for all customer segments, so residential, public, workplace, and fleet. And across the board in their proposals, they proposed higher coverage for sites in environmental justice communities or EJ communities. If you haven't heard that term before, Massachusetts has a state definition for environmental justice communities, which are communities that bear the brunt of pollution in the state and have typically contributed the least to it. And there are different criteria that determine what an environmental justice community is. But basically, both National Grid and Eversource said we want to offer the most support in these communities where there is the most need. A third thing that we look out for a lot, and some of you might have come to webinars on this topic in the fall, is off-peak charging rebates. So National Grid right now, or has offered a pilot program basically, where they offer a residential off-peak charging rebate that is 5 cents per kilowatt hour in the summer and 3 cents per kilowatt hour in the winter. They proposed adding an off-peak charging rebate program for medium and heavy duty vehicles for fleets for up to 1,000. And that was the main change that they proposed on this front with these dockets. Eversource did absolutely nothing on this front. And this prompted one of our main points of critique, that we really think that both utilities could and should go further on off-peak charging rebates. So we worked with the Applied Economics Clinic, which is based in Arlington, Mass, to offer expert testimony on the fact that A, both utilities should offer an off-peak charging rebate, and B, how to correctly size it. So I'll go into that in more detail. But first, I want to just take a moment to explain what off-peak charging rebates are for those of you who might not be familiar with the term. So demand for electricity is not flat throughout the day. Typically, demand is lower at night, and then it ramps up throughout the day, hits a peak around 5 p.m. when everybody comes home and turns on their TVs and their microwaves and runs the dishes and all that, and then it decreases again at night. The price that we as residential consumers pay is flat, so you pay the same number of cents per kilowatt hour regardless of when you use the kilowatt hour, but it actually costs the system varying prices depending on when you use electricity. So if you are turning on your TV at 5 p.m. when everybody is also using electricity, that costs the utility more money to find that electricity for you than if you turn on your TV at 2 in the morning when everybody's asleep. So as we see more electric vehicles coming on the grid, what we don't want is we don't want them to push demand up when we already have peak moments, because when they do that, they exacerbate that peak and they push up the price for everyone. And conversely, if EVs charge when demand is low, which is mostly overnight, that benefits everybody by distributing the fixed costs of the system across more kilowatt hours and not exacerbating those peaks. So the idea of off-peak charging rebates is to actually reflect the change in market prices on peak and non-peak moments via a price signal for EV drivers, so that you are incentivized to charge off-peak, which is good for EV drivers because they get lower fuel costs, good for society because that incentivizes more EV adoption, which has all sorts of climate and public health benefits, but it also just benefits everyone because it decreases peak demand and smooths out demand curves on the grid, which is just better for grid management in general. So as you recall, National Grid has this program that in the summer has an off-peak charging rebate of 5 cents per kilowatt hour, but we think that is just too low because National Grid is not calculating the value of all of the benefits of off-peak charging rebate. They are limiting themselves to calculating the benefits of the actual cost of generating the electricity, but they're not looking at benefits to the transmission and distribution system, to reliability, to capacity and emissions if you shift EV charging off-peak. So what the Applied Economics Clinic did is they did a bunch of math to figure out what an off-peak charging rebate would look like if you actually calculated a value for all of those other benefits. And when you add them all up, it gets closer to 14 cents per kilowatt hour, which is a much larger rebate and a much stronger price signal for EV drivers. So our testimony to the Department of Public Utilities was, hey, we should really calculate a value for all these other benefits because this is not a cross subsidy. Nobody is subsidizing EV drivers. It's just an accurate reflection of the cost to serve them when they're charging off peak. So Applied Economics Clinic, again, did a lot of math and submitted that as expert testimony. The one caveat or I guess qualification I would make right now is that these figures were all calculated using wholesale prices back in 2021. And that was before the invasion of Ukraine and the complete upheaval of particularly natural gas prices, but just generally energy prices that we've seen since then. So if you did this math now, it would likely look different, but the principle of including all of those benefits remains the same. Another thing that the electric utilities proposed was alternatives to demand charges. So for those of you who haven't heard the term demand charges before, that is a term for a type of charge that is assessed on the highest power draw in kilowatts during a billing period. So if you are just a person who pays a personal residential electric bill, you don't see demand charges. You pay based on the number of kilowatt hours you use. But if you are a business or just in a different rate class on your electric bill, you might see demand charges. These really cause a problem for DC fast charging stations because DC fast charging stations will draw a lot of power for short periods of time and can therefore get slammed with really high demand charges. But because we're still at the beginning of the adoption curve, those DC fast charging stations aren't used enough, basically to get enough revenue from the charging to cover those demand charges. So the fact that demand charges exist for EV charging is really a barrier to building out more charging, both DC fast charging and also just large banks of level 2 charging. So National Grid and Eversource proposed a 10-year demand charge discount program based on a sliding scale of how much a charging station is used. So in the table on the right, the first column is load factor, which is basically how much of the time is that station in use. And you can see that there's a corresponding demand charge discount that decreases as usage increases. So if you have a DC fast charging station that's getting used less than 5% of the time, 100% of your demand charge is discounted back to you. If your station is used 5 to 10% of the time, then 75% of the demand charge is discounted back to you. And if you're using it between 10 and 15% of the time, half of the demand charge discount is discounted back to you. So we have heard from lots of people, some of whom I'm sure are on this call, about demand charges at existing stations, causing site hosts to have to charge a lot for the electricity to cover those demand charges. And the hope and intention of this is that by having this sliding scale, you can basically ease new and existing stations into a higher level of usage by discounting demand charges at the beginning. So we'll learn more about that soon, as I'll talk about in a couple slides. I do want to mention a couple other key elements of National Grid and Eversource's proposals. These were really long proposals, and we don't, even in an hour, have time to talk about all the details, but a couple things that stood out are National Grid wanted to offer rebates for up to 300 electric school buses in environmental justice communities. And they wanted to expand the pilot program that they're running right now in Melrose, which is a picture here on the right of pole-mounted on-street charging. They wanted to do 200 more of those in 10 other municipalities. Eversource wanted to do more on electric car sharing and do some work on workforce training. And we'll come back to all of that in a bit. Electric school buses were a key part of our intervention in these dockets. There are such clear public health and equity benefits of electrifying school buses that usually run on diesel and produce known carcinogens as they're driving kids with developing lungs to schools. And there's a clear need for financial support, particularly in environmental justice communities, because there's still an upfront cost premium to these buses. So this was a big part of our testimony, making that clear to the Department of Public Utilities, especially in light of the fact that they now have to consider climate and equity when they make decisions. And we also sponsored testimony from the Massachusetts Public Health Association to really drive home the point about the public health benefits of these school buses. So in sum, our main points on these proposals were, one, that the scale of the utilities proposals is appropriate and needed, because without investment on this level, we won't be able to meet our mandatory emissions reductions by 2030. We really hammered home that National Grid's off-peak charging program should be stronger, and that Eversource should be directed to offer one too, so that there's consistency across service territories. And thirdly, we talked a lot about the need for school bus electrification, and that it's appropriate for the utilities to help with this because of the clear public health and equity implications. So those were our three main points that we tried to make to the DPU. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, the DPU took a very long time to read through everybody's briefs and testimony, and then published at the end of December this 272-page document that is the final order. So I'll go through now exactly what was in that and what it means for EV drivers in Massachusetts. So top line news is that the DPU approved $400 million for EV charging. So National Grid, none of the electric utilities had their full proposals approved. So these budgets are smaller than we saw at the beginning of the presentation, but National Grid is approved for $206 million over 4 years. Eversource is approved for $188 million over 4 years, and Unitil is approved for $1 million over 5 years. This is huge. So there are some other buckets of funding coming down the pike, so to speak, for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. You might have heard of the NEVI program, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. That is bringing $63 million to Massachusetts. The Transportation Bond Bill has potentially $50 million in it for charging, and then last year's Economic Development Bill in Massachusetts put $50 million towards charging infrastructure too, and all of that is dwarfed by this $400 million over the next couple of years, which is not to say that we have too much. This is a big challenge that we need to meet, and it's good to see funding made available at a scale close to what we need to meet these goals. I will now summarize exactly what support the DPU approved for different segments in two buckets, the make-ready and the EVSE rebates. So basically, the DPU approved make-ready support for all segments for up to 100% of infrastructure costs. I say up to because the electric utilities are now taking this final order and turning it into actual programmatic materials, and they may decide that for certain segments they want to offer a lower make-ready support so that they can offer more in other segments. But the DPU approved up to 100% for all residential, public and workplace, and fleets, which is great news. So that is that whole first column. It gets more complicated on the EVSE rebate side. Again, this is support for the hardware and installation of the actual charging unit. And here it depends on what segment we're in. So for residences with 1 to 4 units, there are EVSE rebates available, but only for customers enrolled in the low income discount rate and the managed charging program. And for those customers, it's up to 100% of the hardware and installation costs. So if you live in a single family home and are not on the low income discount rate, there is no EVSE rebate for you. But if you are on the low income discount rate, and when you install the charging, you enroll in the managed charging program of the electric utility, then 100% of those, up to 100% of the hardware and installation is covered. For multi-unit dwellings that have 5 or more units, it depends on the location of the site. So if the community where the site is meets the income criterion for an environmental justice community, then 100% of the hardware and installation is covered. If it meets a different EJ criterion, then 75% is covered. And if it's not an EJ community, then only 50% is covered. There's a similar sliding scale for public and workplace charging, with the additional requirement that the site has to meet the definition of a publicly accessible site as defined by the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection's Mass EVIP program. But there again, if the community meets the EJ income criterion, then it's 100%. If it's a different criterion, it's 75%, and otherwise it's 50%. And then finally, on the fleet side, there are EVSE rebates available, or there will be, for public fleets only, and in Eversource service territory, that's restricted to fleets that are enrolled in its fleet assessment pilot offering for medium and heavy duty fleets. So I know this is a lot of information. This is on this slide. We'll share the slides afterwards, and we also have a blog post that summarizes it, but this is sort of big picture what was approved by the DPU for Make Ready and EVSE rebates. One note, as some of you may know, that if you offer a public charging station that is smart, as in the sense that it's available online, people can pay with a credit card or reserve it in advance, you have to pay a monthly networking cost to make sure that it's actually online, so to speak. And that is an additional cost that those public sites bear. And the DPU approved networking rebates for publicly accessible sites and residential locations with 5 or more units. So that's just an additional source of funding for some of these sites. In terms of budget allocation, if you look at the numbers, about half of the funding is available for public and workplace charging, about a third is available for residential, and then smaller chunks for fleets and some other stuff that we'll talk about too. That slightly smaller budget results in a slightly smaller number of expected ports that'll be enabled from these approved programs. So these are estimates from National Grid and Eversource's press releases after the final DPU order came out. National Grid bundled all of its residential ports together and said they expect to do about 24,000 of those, and then 7,000 public and workplace charging stations. Eversource broke it out in a little bit more detail, said 16,000 residential stations for 1 to 4 units, 2,000 for multi-unit dwellings, and then a couple thousand each for public and workplace charging. And on the off-peak charging rebates, we got a mixed bag in the final DPU order. So the good news is National Grid approved, the DPU approved National Grid's proposed residential extension and the expansion of the off-peak charging rebate to medium and heavy-duty vehicle fleets. They ordered that consumers or fleets be allowed to participate via multiple avenues, so either connecting the vehicle telematics to the electric utility or by using a networked charging station or a smart charging station at home. But unfortunately, they denied everything that we made a case for. So they denied the rebate amount increase. We had argued that weekends should be included in off-peak charging rebates. They denied that too, and they did not require Eversource to offer an off-peak charging rebate. So obviously we are disappointed by this. We're pursuing this legislatively since it did not work on the regulatory front, but in sum, a mixed bag on this front. The demand charge alternatives program was approved, which is great news for lots of different reasons. It's great news for people or school districts that want to have school buses and charge a fleet of school buses. It's great news for DC fast charging stations in general. It's great news for banks of level 2 charging stations. So this is really great. It will take National Grid and Eversource 6 months to set that all up, but the sliding scale approach is approved. There was in each proposal some amount of or some small offerings for fleet assessments. Some of that got denied, some of it got approved, but what eventually did get approved is fleet assessment services for public fleets only. The DPU is encouraging both National Grid and Eversource to prioritize eligible fleets in environmental justice communities. And Eversource specifically is approved to run a 2-year pilot program with medium and heavy duty vehicle fleets to gather data before offering make ready to fleets in general. One note on that, we in our testimony made the case that they don't really need to do a 2-year pilot to know that make ready would be useful to fleets in general, but the DPU did not listen to us there either. So Eversource did get the okay to do this pilot program before extending make ready to all fleets. And then there are a couple of things that were denied completely. So the DPU ordered or denied National Grid's request to offer rebates for electric school buses. Their reasoning was that there's funding coming from the federal government, and so this funding isn't needed. We disagree. They denied EVSE rebates. Again, those are the rebates for the hardware and installation of charging stations for any residential customers in 1 to 4 unit homes that are not low income. We think this is a mistake because particularly the way the car market is looking in the next 4 years, it's unlikely that people who are enrolled in the low income electricity rate will be able to afford a new or even used electric vehicle. So we think limiting it this much will make it less effective. The DPU also denied the expansion of National Grid's pole-mounted charging pilot because they thought it would impede the development of the private sector basically in that space. They denied support for electric car sharing programs, saying the electric utility has no business doing that, and they denied the workforce and electrician training pieces that the utilities had proposed. So all of that leads us here. So I'll go through now what real quick and then jump into questions because I'm sure there are many. So first, there are 2 requests for the DPU to reconsider decisions they made that we're waiting to hear from the DPU on. So first, the Attorney General is asking the DPU to reconsider limiting the residential EVSE rebates to people who are on the low income rate. The Attorney General's office is arguing that we have a system now that will make it easier to determine who is moderate income, and that system wasn't available at the time of this whole proceeding. So they're saying, okay, now we have a system, so given that system, we really think we should offer these rebates to moderate income consumers too. And then secondly, the DPU made a mistake when they were setting the goals for how much of these investments should be directed to environmental justice communities. They wanted to make that proportional to the number of customers for each electric utility that live in environmental justice communities, and they made a math mistake. So a couple of intervenors have requested that they fix that math mistake effectively. And we as green energy consumers have submitted comments in support of both of these requests for reconsideration. Procedurally, the next steps are the utilities had to file compliance tariff filings, basically saying, yep, we got it, and this is how we're going to do all of this. Those are in the DPU's hands now. There's a whole separate process to determine what the performance metrics will be for the utilities, and that doesn't even start until April. But really the key piece for, I think, all of you on this call is that National Grid and Eversource are working right now to actually roll out these new programs. So they, in the next month or 2, will actually have web pages where you can apply for these and have forms and have all the details that I'm sure people have questions on. And we're working on setting up some webinars with representatives from National Grid and Eversource once those program materials are up to talk through those details too. I will turn to questions now, but one final thought that I want to put out there is that this whole process, the order of operations did not occur in a way that is conducive to good climate planning. This whole process started with investor-owned utilities saying, this is what we want to do, and then the Department of Public Utilities saying, okay, yes, you can, or no, you can't. And what we would like to see the state shift towards is the state going, this is what we need to meet our emissions reductions requirement by 2025 and 2030. Electric utilities, please go do that. So that's kind of an open-ended, bigger picture question to end this on. And I would be remiss if I did not include this slide saying if you learned something from this webinar and are able to support our work, we would love that. Of course, we're a nonprofit, we're mission driven. So anything that you can contribute helps us go out and vigorously shake our fist at the DPU and ask them to do things that will support electrification. So thank you all very much for listening to me that long, and I will now pull up the questions and see what we have. So bear with me for a moment while I get oriented here. There is a question that says, how can I find out if I am in an environmental justice community? There is a map that the state has where you can look at the whole state and figure out which sections are an environmental justice community and which meet which requirements. So I'll make a note to share that map when we send out the slides and the recording. But I think the electric utilities will also have a system set up so that you can figure it out on their website. Okay, let me see. Okay, there's a question saying, okay, this webinar was all about Massachusetts programs. What do you anticipate the timeline for federally funded programs being? So I will answer this briefly, but point you to more resources on our website. The federally funded programs come in a couple buckets. So one is the NEVI program that I've mentioned before. That's the one that is going to build out DC fast charging along our highways. That is a program that will be administered by the State Department of Transportation. So they have released a plan. They took feedback on that plan, and now they are working on an RFP to actually go hire someone to build these charging stations. So those should be coming in the next year or so. Other than that, there are now stronger incentives to help build out charging, mostly in the form of tax credits. And I will point you to a webinar we did last week that covered that. So I'll share those slides in the thank you email we'll send out too. So this is an excellent question saying, effectively, I live in a municipal utility, so does any of this apply? The answer is no. So municipal utilities did not go through this process. They have a different process, and they actually have a little bit more flexibility to offer cool programs. So many of the municipal utilities in Massachusetts have for years actually been offering off-peak charging rebates, rebates for the installation of charging, and all sorts of other cool incentives. So if you live in a place with a municipal utility, go talk to your municipal utility and see what kinds of programs they offer. All of this presentation was about the investor-owned utilities. And I'll add to that, if you are one of the few people who lives in Unitil territory, when the electric utilities roll out the information on their new programs, we'll include that too. We limited it to National Grid and Eversource for this presentation because they really carry the bulk of customers in Massachusetts, but Unitil will have some programs too. There's a question about, could I explain in more detail why the pole-mounted pilot project expansion was denied? I cannot at the moment. We were not satisfied by the explanation the DPU gave because it's very clear by the lack of other on-street charging station options in Massachusetts that the private market is not meeting that need, and clearly we have some more work to do. But I can double check the language in the actual final order and get back to you on that question. There's a question about how do you enroll in a managed charging program. I will send out some instructions on that too. The National Grid and Eversource have slightly different programs, but the short answer is you go to your electric utility's website and find the section on smart charging and fill it out. Some of them have off-peak charging rebates, specifically National Grid and some of the municipal utilities. And then there are also different types of managed charging programs where basically you sign up and allow the electric utility to ramp down your charging at super peak moments, like a handful of days in the summer when the whole system is really overloaded. You basically give them the authority to pause your charging or slow down your charging in exchange for an incentive. So you can choose which one of those programs makes more sense for you if you go to your utilities website. So there is a question from someone saying, I'm a National Grid customer looking to install a home charger in the coming months. Knowing that National Grid and Eversource still need to implement these programs, any advice for the short term prior to receiving any updates from the electric companies? So if you are thinking about installing a charger in the coming months, I would say hold off for a month. I am hopeful that we will get more information from the electric utilities soon. I don't think they'll make all of these incentives available retroactively. And even if they did, there will likely be requirements about you have to purchase a certain type of equipment or purchase a charger from a list of approved equipment. So I wouldn't want you to go out and purchase a charger that then doesn't qualify. What a lot of people do, even independently of these programs, is some people, when they get an EV, will start with level 1 charging, basically plugging their vehicle into an existing 120 volt outlet, and do that for a little bit and just to see how it goes. And some people never install a level 2 charging station after that. But if you can get by with that or public charging for a month or two, it might be worth it because you'll have these new programs. There's a question, let me see. So there's one question about the goals slide, and I'll go back to it. It'll take me a while to go back to it. So the goal slide that I had at the beginning showed how many charging stations and vehicles we need in Massachusetts. And there might be some confusion. Oops, I think I went too far. Excuse me as I go through this entire presentation again. There we go. So Massachusetts needs 200,000 and 900,000 vehicles by 2025 and 2030, but the number of charging stations that we need is 15,000 and 75,000 chargers. So the idea when National Grid and Eversource made their proposals for each of the segments, they said, we're sizing this to meet a certain % of the projected need. So the idea is that the private sector would fill in the difference. So it's not that we need 200,000 chargers by 2025, it's 200,000 vehicles and 15,000 chargers. Let me see. You all are asking very good questions. Let me see. There's one question about, does the property have to be your primary residence, or could it also be a vacation home with a separate Eversource account? It does not matter if it's your primary residence or not. It just matters what electric utility you have an account with. Let's see. There's a little bit of a more taking a step back from the details and more about how does this all work question saying, can you explain the primary motivations of these electric utilities and how they explain some of the positions they took in this proceeding? So this quickly gets complicated, and I will answer it high level, and then if you have more questions we can chat on email. But high level, electric utilities want to see electrification because ultimately it is good for them if we are buying more electricity. It is not directly good for them, so electric utilities in Massachusetts don't make money off of how many kilowatt hours of electricity they supply to you. They make money off of the value and the investments they make in the infrastructure. So the DPU in different proceedings in the rate cases that they put forward basically approves a fixed rate of return on the infrastructure that they build and maintain. So the utilities, for example, on off-peak charging discounts are resistant to offer discounts on the transmission and distribution benefits because that is where they make their money. So that is part of the story, but I'm oversimplifying a lot. But what we think, I think this question is getting at, like, how do we advocate for the system to work better? And that's where we are really glad that last year's climate bill included this Intergovernmental Council on EV charging to bring together the different agencies, make sure that DOT and the Department of Transportation, the Department of Energy Resources, the Department of Public Utilities, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, that they are all talking to each other on this specific issue so that we can align development in this space better. So I think if the question was getting more at the advocacy front, that would be my answer. And that's something that commission is supposed to be meeting. We have sent a gentle but direct letter saying, when is that commission meeting? Are the meetings public? And that's something we'll be keeping an eye on and writing about. So if you want to join us in that, we would welcome it. Let's see, we have about 3 minutes left. Let me see. There's so many good questions. Okay, there's one question that I'll end on because it's a thing that we're excited about. So when I spoke about demand charges, I was talking about the fact that certain site hosts get charged based on the peak power that they draw. And one way of mitigating that is through these demand charge alternatives, and that's the proposal the utilities put forward, and that's the one that was approved. Another way of addressing that problem is co-locating chargers with storage and solar, so that basically you add some sophisticated software to the mix, and then when somebody plugs in, the software goes, okay, is it better for me to draw power from the grid right now, or from the battery, or from the solar panels? And that allows you to reduce the maximum power draw that you're pulling from the grid, which reduces demand charges, but also makes for a more resilient system by adding another source of solar, which is always good, and these batteries can offer backup charging and help with lots of other things, balancing supply and demand on the grid. So there's a question about, is there any plan to integrate this in there? There is some stuff on that in the docket that just we didn't fit into this presentation, but I can include some of that information in the follow-up email. So it is 1 o'clock. There are many questions we did not get to. I want to say a big thank you for those of you staying through this very, very wonky presentation. This is a getting into the weeds kind of presentation. So thanks for bearing with us. If you have any questions, please feel free to send us an email. You can reach us at drivegreen@greenenergyconsumers.org, and we will do our best to answer them. And look out for an email today or tomorrow with the recording of this webinar and the slides and some of the other resources that we've mentioned. But with that, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the unseasonably warm weather and have a great weekend. Bye.